Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. In this video, I'm going to explain about the female reproductive system. So let's look at the first diagram here, the female reproductive organ, which is the ovaries. Each females are usually born with a pair of ovaries. Each month, one of the ovaries will release a secondary oocyte for fertilization. So the secondary oocyte, let's look at the structure of the secondary oocyte. The secondary oocyte is this structure, which contain a nucleus that contain the DNA and the cytoplasm. This is the cytoplasm. Secondary oocyte are always accompanied by the first polar body. Secondary oocyte encased or surrounded by the zona pellucida, which is a gel-like structure, which is a thick glycoprotein layer. This one, this one. So this is the zona pellucida. The zona pellucida. The zona pellucida is then surrounded by layers of follicle cells. These are all follicle cells. And this structure, the collection of these follicle cells are known as corona radiata. Corona radiata is made up of granulosa cells of the follicle itself. So secondary oocyte is haploid, meaning that it will have one set of chromosome from the parent cell. The secondary oocyte are surrounded or contain cytoplasm and surrounded by plasma membrane. So the process of producing female gamete in human is called oogenesis. Oogenesis is the process of ovum production in the ovary. Oogenesis, unlike male, oogenesis starts before the female is being born, before birth. Unlike spermatogenesis, which only start when male reach puberty. So oogenesis begins in the female embryo while we are still an embryo. The primordial germ cell in the ovary will divide by mitosis to increase their number. So we will have a lot of oogonia in the ovary. During the third month of embryonic development, the oogonium will divide by mitosis to form two primary oocytes. The primary oocyte will then undergo meiosis 1, to start the formation of gamete. But then, before the female is being born, the primary oocyte will undergo meiosis but stop at prophase 1. Arrested here means stop. You can use the word stop or you can use the word arrested, but stop at prophase 1, so it's not wrong. I repeat, primary oocyte undergo meiosis but stop at prophase 1. So females are born with primary oocytes that is still undergoing meiosis, meaning not undergoing meiosis, they are still in prophase 1 stage. So the primary oocyte in the follicles, small follicles of the ovary, the chromosome, you can imagine the chromatins are condensed and form visible chromosome, and then the chromosome starts to pair to form bivalent. So they are undergoing synapsis. So it stops at that stage. And then the female grow up until they reach puberty. Only then the anterior pituitary gland will start to secrete the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. So this is the time where the follicle will be stimulated. stimulated and continue the oogenesis. So each month after starting from the puberty, from that moment forward, at each month one follicle will mature into Graafian follicle. Maksudnya proses meiosis tadi hanya satu sel sahaja yang akan undergo continue the meiosis 1 tadi yang terberhenti sampailah secondary oocyte terhasil dan dilepaskan. At each month usually one ovary is involved to release one secondary oocyte. So the mature Graafian follicles will contain the primary oocyte that has completed the meiosis 1. So it will continue later on to meiosis 2. So this is the mature follicle and this is the oocyte, either the secondary or the primary. So at the end of meiosis 1, after the telophase 1, cytokinesis should occur to produce two daughter cells. One is primary oocyte, one is secondary oocyte, and another one is the polar body. But the cytokinesis happens unequally. It is unequal division. Because of that, it will form a smaller polar body and a larger secondary oocyte. So the first polar body may or may not divide, and eventually it will degenerate. So we are not going to discuss more details about what happened to the polar body. Let's look at the secondary oocyte. So the secondary oocyte contained in the Graafian follicles ataupun the follicles lah, sebab dia baru nak continue meiosis 2. So the secondary oocyte will continue meiosis 2 but then stop again at metaphase 2. So boleh bayangkan metaphase 2, what is the behavior of the chromosome? So the chromosome, it is no longer having their pair. The chromosome is not in pair. They are already separated through meiosis 1 during anaphase 1. So in this stage, dia akan berhenti dalam keadaan chromosomes aligned at the metaphase plate. So it stopped there. Okay, then the secondary oocyte will be released through ovulation process. And then ovulation process, the secondary oocyte is released and it will wait for the sperm to fertilize the secondary oocyte. While in the ovary, the ruptured Graafian follicle will develop into a structure named corpus luteum. And in the end, at the end of the cycle, or eventually, corpus luteum will degenerate if there is no fertilization. Okay, follicle graph tadi, Graafian follicle adalah follicle yang matang. Selepas dia lepaskan oocyte sekunder, secondary oocyte, follicle graph ni sendiri akan membentuk struktur yang dipanggil corpus luteum. Dan corpus luteum later on will just degenerate. Okay, dia akan hilang dalam struktur ovary. Only if fertilization occur, the meiosis 2 will be completed. Okay, with the presence of the sperm, then the meiosis 2 will be completed. The chromosome from the sperm will align themselves will align at the metaphase plate, and then they will divide. Continue to divide through anaphase and then telophase, and then produce two cells, and then continue the development of the zygote. So the meiosis 2, after the meiosis 2, cytokinesis will occur, producing another polar body, and a larger mature ovum or mature egg with sperm head. So the sperm head is still in the cytoplasm of the egg, the secondary oocyte, the ovum lah. This is the summary. Oogenesis begins before birth but stop at prophase 1, and then the female is born. So during this period of time, from the birth to the puberty, the oogenesis will resume under hormonal control. Will be suppressed or arrested, and it will start again, resume under hormonal control when the female reach puberty. But still it will not complete unless fertilization occur. This is the secondary oocyte that is being released from the mature follicle. So it should be released and transferred into the fallopian tube, where it will wait for the sperm to fertilize the oocyte. The ruptured follicle then will form corpus luteum. Female reproductive cycles are explained based on the 28 days of each cycle. So this is the ideal explanation, the easiest explanation, the easiest number to explain the cycles. Normally, in real life, the days might vary. Some person might have less than 28 days, such as 25, 24. Or some female might have extended days, more than 28. It might extend it to 30 days for each cycle. But more or less, in your syllabus, we are going to explain based on 28 days. So let's look at the cycles involved in female reproduction. First is the uterine cycle or the menstrual cycle, which involve the events that occur in the endometrium, the uterus lining. And the second cycle is the ovarian cycle, which involve the changes in the ovary. So they are interrelated because with the presence of hormones, they will affect each other. To explain the cycles, we will have to relate with the hormones, and to be able to explain this, the relationship of the hormones, the relationship of the hormone or the effect of the hormones to the cycles, we need to understand the function of the hormones. This diagram shows there are two groups of hormones, the LH and FSH, and also the estrogen and progesterone. This is because FSH and LH are secreted by a different organ than estrogen and progesterone. FSH and LH are released by anterior pituitary, while estrogen and progesterone, estradiol is another name of for estrogen. Estrogen and progesterone is released by the structure in the ovary. Okay, let's look at the diagram here. This is the hypothalamus in the brain. Same with what happened in the male. So hypothalamus secretes GnRH, and GnRH will stimulate anterior pituitary. This is the anterior pituitary. Then anterior pituitary will secrete FSH and LH that will act on the ovary. Okay. While because of the secretion of FSH and LH, the follicle is developed. The follicle will develop into a mature follicle, and since the follicle is growing, it will secrete estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen and progesterone will act on the uterus. Okay, the uterus lining, the endometrium. Let's look at the explanation. First is ovarian cycle. Ovarian cycle involve follicular phase. Follicular phase from the words follicle itself. So what happens in follicular phase is the growth of the follicles and the oocyte becomes mature. Another event that occurs during ovarian cycle is ovulation. Ovulation is the process when the secondary oocyte is released from the mature follicle. And the next event is luteal phase. Luteal phase is the period of luteal phase is at the end of the cycle, the second part of the cycle. So luteal phase involves development and degeneration of corpus luteum. Hence the name is closely related with this word, luteal phase. So it is the development of corpus luteum and the degeneration of the corpus luteum. So ovarian cycle focus on what happened in the ovary. Follicular phase is day 1 to day 14 because we explain based on 28 days. While luteal phase is the second part. So ovulation events that release the secondary oocyte occurs in the middle of the ovarian cycle. So this is the follicles growing and maturing, producing secondary oocyte. Then it will be released. Secondary oocyte will be released. So this is the ovulation. So this one is the follicular phase, and this one is the luteal phase. During follicular phase, hypothalamus secrete gene NRH, gonadotropic releasing hormone, which will stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete small amounts of FSH and LH. And that's why we can look at, as we can see in the diagram, the amount of the FSH and LH is still in small amount compared to day 14. So a small increase of FSH and LH will stimulate follicle growth. Okay. Since FSH is released, it will help the follicle to grow and develop. So the follicle will start to secrete estrogen. So in the beginning of the ovarian cycle, the estrogen increased because the stimulation from the FSH. Okay, because follicle cell, the follicles starts to secrete the estrogen. At the beginning, the low level of the estrogen will inhibit anterior pituitary from releasing more FSH and LH. Jadi estrogen akan meningkat, tapi dalam keadaan yang masih dalam keberkatan yang masih rendah. So this low level will inhibit the more production of FSH. So that because this negative feedback is important, so to make sure that only one follicle will continue to grow. Kalau banyak lagi FSH, it might affect the growth of another follicle. So we need only one follicle to develop at a time. Each month. Then as estrogen start to increase more, the level starts to increase, and the high level of the estrogen will stimulate hypothalamus to increase secretion of GnRH. So GnRH will further stimulate anterior pituitary to produce large amount of LH. That's why you can see that the increase of the estrogen will increase the LH. LH will be more than the FSH. FSH will be decreased. So kenapa FSH decrease? Sebab tadi kita tak nak ada lagi follicle yang akan berkembang. Tetapi kita nak follicle yang berkembang tu terus berkembang untuk menghasilkan corpus luteum. Sebab apa? Nak hasilkan corpus luteum, kita kena release the secondary oocyte. So LH is actually will aid in the release of secondary oocyte. Okay? So this will result in final maturation of the follicle. The high level of LH will trigger ovulation. So the graphene follicle will release the secondary oocyte, will be ruptured, pecah, and release the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. Since the secondary oocyte has been released, the LH will transform into corpus luteum. So since beginning from the formation of corpus luteum, once the corpus luteum is formed, it will take over because sebelum ni pun memang follicle yang rembeskan estrogen kan. Jadi dia akan continue, cuma nama dia dah jadi corpus luteum. So corpus luteum will secrete estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone. Sebab tu kita akan nampak ada a slight increase for estrogen, but progesterone is increased more. Jadi the amount of progesterone is more than the estrogen. Dua-dua akan naik, tapi progesterone lebih banyak. Sebab apa? Kita akan tengok fungsi progesterone adalah to maintain the thickening of the endometrium. This is very important to prepare for implantation of zygote, meaning that if fertilization occurs, there will be implantation. So the zygote the embryo should be implanted in a very strong endometrium. This is why at the approaching end of ovarian cycle, when we approach the end of menstrual cycle or ovarian cycle, the amount of progesterone is high and the LH will decrease rapidly. As estrogen and progesterone level rise, this combination of hormones will form negative feedback on the hypothalamus and pituitary. So the negative feedback will inhibit the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. Thus, it will reduce secretion of LH and FSH to a very low level. Itu sebab dia akan turun. Yang ini penting sebab kita nak prepare for fertilization and implantation. Kita nak prepare kalau mengandung, takkan nak hasilkan lagi FSH. So to make sure that no more FSH will trigger the maturity of the follicle, to trigger the follicle to grow, nak prevent daripada the growth of another follicle lah. Sebab kita nak tunggu kalau mengandung ke tak kan. So now we will have to reduce the amount of the FSH and the LH, and progesterone and estrogen should increase to maintain the endometrium. So we will wait if there is any fertilization. Because of the negative feedback, the gonadotropic releasing hormone, the GnRH, concentration is low. So at the end of the luteal phase, it will cause the corpus luteum to disintegrate. Sebab tadi the high amount of estrogen and progesterone will affect the hypothalamus. So less GnRH causing the corpus luteum to degenerate. So the disintegration of the corpus luteum will trigger a sharp decline in estrogen and progesterone. Nampak tak dia menurun sekarang? So this decrease will release the hypothalamus from inhibition. So hypothalamus will secrete GnRH and thus will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH again. So this will help to stimulate another follicle to grow. Okey, tadi ovarian cycle, apa yang berlaku dalam ovari. Sekarang dengan pengetahuan yang kita ada tadi, kita akan tengok pula, bincangkan uterine cycle pula. So this is what happened at the endometrium. Sebab tu dia lebih kepada menstrual flow. So menstrual flow is the same with bleeding, the shedding of endometrium, the rupture of an endometrium. Endometrium starts to shed off. And then proliferative phase is when the endometrium is being regenerated, start to thicken, menebal. And then secretory phase is the secretion, the process of secretion of the endometrium. Jadi secretion ni adalah secretion nutrients, cecair yang ada nutrients, yang ada bahan-bahan untuk mengukuhkan dinding endometrium. Dinding uterus, the endometrium. Jadi ada 3 dalam uterine cycle. Menstrual flow phase. Bleeding tu biasanya day 1 to day 6. Some female might have an extended menstrual flow phase. Mungkin hari pertama sampai hari ke-6, 8, ke-10, ada yang sampai 14. And then proliferative phase adalah masa untuk baik pulih endometrium kita. Tu proliferative phase. And then bila dah baik pulih, dia nak maintain endometrium tu. Sebab apa? Nak tunggu jika ada persenyawaan. Okey, kenapa kita boleh bleeding? Menstrual flow, what makes the menstrual flow to occur? This is because the corpus luteum degenerate tadi kan. Macam sambungan lah, dia macam sambungan. Tapi sebenarnya interrelated. It occurs almost the same, sebenarnya sama. Pada masa yang sama. Sebab tadi ovarian kita cerita tentang perkembangan follicle dulu. Sekarang ni kita cerita tentang uterine cycle shed off dulu. Pada uterus, the endometrium is being shed off. So kenapa berlaku pendarahan tu? Sebab level of estrogen and progesterone is low, decrease. Kenapa? Why their level is decreased? Because corpus luteum is disintegrated. So no more secretion of estrogen and progesterone. So it will lead to constriction of arteries in the endometrium. Because of the constriction, the supply of blood and oxygen do not happen. So the cells of the endometrium will die and then it will disintegrate and it should be discharged through menstruation. When the menstrual flow settle, the endometrium, all of the dead tissues of the endometrium have been discharged, the increasing amount of estrogen will help to thicken the endometrium, to build up again the endometrium. So dari mana datang estrogen estrogen dulu, sebab estrogen increase first to thicken and repair the endometrium. So dari mana datang estrogen ni? Ia datang daripada growing follicle. Ingat tak? Okay, growing follicle. Sebab kalau nak kita relatekan dengan apa yang berlaku dalam ovary tadi, pada peringkat ni FSH start to increase. So when FSH start to increase, because it is being released by the anterior pituitary, so it helps to the follicle to grow. The growing follicle will release estrogen. Okay, sebab tu estrogen will start to increase. And then ovulation in the ovary. So kita tak cerita yang ovary tu, kita cerita yang uterine cycle. So berkaitan dia, selepas ovulation, estrogen dengan progesterone akan dirembeskan oleh corpus luteum. So at this point forward, from this during this phase, the estrogen will maintain their amount, but the progesterone amount is higher to stimulate the continuation of the endometrium development and to maintain. Nampak tak dia punya pembuluh darah dia lebih banyak dan lebih besar kat sini. So the thickening of the wall is maintained. This is why it is important to prepare for implantation. Okay, let's look at the possibility of if there is no pregnancy, meaning that there is no fertilization, so no implantation of zygote. What happened then? The estrogen and progesterone level decline or decrease because the corpus luteum starts to disintegrate. So when the estrogen and progesterone level decline, it will cause constriction of artery in the endometrium. Will later on leads to menstrual flow. Dah mula balik lah sebab tak ada persenyawaan. Okay, constriction of artery cause less supply of oxygen and nutrients, so the endometrium will die and shed off during menstrual flow. If pregnancy occur, if fertilization occur, then the zygote will be implanted, should be implanted in the endometrium. Okay, so once the implantation occurs, the developing placenta here will secrete HCG. The full name is human chorionic gonadotropin. So this HCG will maintain the corpus luteum. Sebab tadi kalau tak ada fertilization, corpus luteum tu tak ada apa-apa yang boleh maintain dia punya struktur. Jadi dia akan kecut, dia akan disintegrate. So since there is pregnancy, the developing placenta will secrete HCG that will help to maintain the structure of corpus luteum. So since corpus luteum is still there, it will continue to secrete estrogen and progesterone. Okay, the corpus luteum will be there, will continue to secrete estrogen and progesterone only until placenta is fully developed. Once the placenta is fully developed, it will start to take over the secretion of estrogen and progesterone. So once the placenta take over the secretion of estrogen and progesterone, corpus luteum will disintegrate. Let's look at this table that shows the role of hormones in the ovarian and uterine cycle. GnRH, which is secreted by hypothalamus, function to stimulate anterior pituitary gland to secrete FSH and LH. The follicle stimulating hormone, the FSH, will stimulate development of follicle in the ovary. LH stimulate ovulation, which is the release of the secondary oocyte. So at the same time ataupun secara tak langsung, the LH stimulate the transformation of Graafian follicle into corpus luteum. Dia transform daripada Graafian follicle, sebab dia dah hilang secondary oocyte, the structure is known as corpus luteum. secreted by the developing follicle and corpus luteum is to stimulate the repair and thickening of the endometrium, while progesterone is to maintain the thickening of the endometrium. Yang tebal tu kita nak maintain dia supaya kekal tebal. Tak ada progesterone, walaupun ada estrogen, tapi tak ada progesterone, the endometrium cannot maintain the structure. It will be dia akan mula shed off. So to relate, kita boleh nampak, okay kan, FSH is related to the to the follicle in the ovary, FSH dengan LH. So without the GnRH, there will be no FSH and LH. So no FSH and LH, no growing follicle. So if there is no growing follicle, then there will be no estrogen and progesterone. So in another way, tak ada penebalan dinding uterus. The growing follicle secrete estrogen that will further leads to slow rise in estrogen. So the endometrium will get thickened and repaired. At the same time, kita kena ingat masa kita penebalan dinding, kita nak prepare untuk fertilization. Nak fertilization mesti kena ada secondary oocyte. Pada masa itu follicle dah mula berkembang. So kita tak nak another follicle to develop. So only one follicle. So we need the FSH to stop being secreted. Okay. Under continuous stimulation by LH, corpus luteum will secrete estrogen and progesterone. And then estrogen and progesterone stimulate development and maintenance of the endometrium. High level of estrogen and progesterone affect the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary negatively. So LH and FSH will be inhibited from being secreted. Corpus luteum at the end of ovarian cycle is the same as the beginning of the uterine cycle. Kita nampak berkaitan dia sebab apa, pada masa itu masa corpus luteum start to disintegrate, kita dah mula start untuk rasa cramping, kita sakit, kita nak period, macam orang kata PMS kan, premenstrual syndrome, kita dah mula rasa tak selesa. So once the corpus luteum memang habis disintegrate, tak ada estrogen and progesterone, then the endometrium will shed off, so we will be bleeding. Decrease in estrogen and progesterone adalah permulaan kepada ovarian cycle pula balik. Okay, so you can look at the diagram, the summary of the hormonal menstruation, hormonal regulation, and look at the negative feedback. Estrogen and progesterone, negative feedback towards anterior pituitary and hypothalamus. Ini masa bila ni? Ini masa growing follicle, pertama growing follicle, dan kemudian masa corpus luteum. Color ni, okay. So that's all for female reproductive system. We will continue to the next video about fertilization and development.